The great hall had gone so quiet that Magnus could hear wax drip from the candelabra near the throne dais, one heavy drop at a time, while 600 witnesses held their breath and waited to see whether a king would break his own world in public. Raven Ironhold stood 3 steps below the throne, not seated, not armored, wearing only the black formal coat reserved for treaty declarations. That was already wrong. Kings sat when they wanted distance. He had chosen to stand where she could reach him. Across the chamber, Lord Caius Thornmere looked almost serene, chain of office bright against his pale throat, as if the hearing that morning and the no-confidence motion filed before noon had been merely paperwork on the way to his inevitable victory. He kept his gaze on Raven, never on her, as if she were still what he had called her in 2029, unsuitable, a problem to be managed in a room where better bloodlines spoke. Magnus stood between 4 royal wolves in steel-gray cloaks, the protection detail Raven had assigned her the night her suppressants failed. She had spent 5 days thinking those wolves were a prettier kind of cage. At this distance from the throne, she could see each of them tracking exits. Hands close to blades, shoulders angled to shield her from the council benches where no confidence votes could turn into knives if fear ran hot enough. The High Council clerk read the motion in a voice that shook anyway. If 9 of 13 voted no confidence, Raven lost provisional command for the remainder of Winter Accord, treaty authority transferred to Lord Thornmere, and any claim he made tonight could be voided before dawn. Magnus did not look at the council benches yet. She looked at Raven's profile, hard and unreadable, the face that had terrified provinces into peace, and now held itself perfectly still, while his advisor demanded he prove he had not been compromised by scent fraud. Compromised. By her. Caius stepped forward and bowed with infuriating grace. Your Majesty, withdraw the claim language and ratify the Thornmere-Northgate Treaty now. The Council can still preserve stability. Raven did not raise his voice. You drafted that treaty to purchase my compliance. Caius spread his hands, every inch the patient statesman. I drafted it to protect succession from deception. That word landed like a slap because Magnus had spoken truth under oath that morning, and truth had stripped her raw in front of the same hall. She had admitted she lived under scent null registration for 12 months. She had admitted her sister forged renewal signatures after Thornmere auditors cut off access to legal suppressants. She had admitted she feared exile more than prison, and that fear had made lying feel like breathing. Raven finally turned his head toward her, just enough for her to see the change in his eyes, the contained edge she had begun to recognize as him deciding the world could pay any price except her. Stand with me, he said. The hall broke into whispers so loud they sounded like rain on stone. Magnus stepped past her guards because she had reached the point where fear and clarity felt the same. She had one thought left, clean and sharp. If he is making me into a symbol, I will still choose where I stand. She put her hand in his. The council clerk lifted the tally board. 8 for no confidence, 5 against. The motion failed by 1 vote. The world shifted without moving. Caius's face did not change. His eyes did, and she saw the calculation die in them for the first time since 2029. Raven pulled Magnus to his side and spoke so the back wall could hear him. I claim Magnus Valewood as mate and queen consort regent by Ironhold law. Let any challenge name coercion now, in witness of 600. No one spoke. To understand why that silence felt like thunder to her, the story had to return to the day she learned what public humiliation sounded like when everyone you trusted stayed quiet. In 2029, Magnus was 21 and still naive enough to think rituals existed to protect people. The provincial pairing rite in Valewood had been held in late autumn, in a stone ring older than every house around it, where families came layered in fur and expectation and gossip that smelled like warm wine. She had worn her mother's green sash, repaired at the hem twice, and stood on the marked slate, while officiants asked Caius Thornmere if he accepted preliminary bond recognition. He had been her betrothed by arrangement for 11 months. He had visited her father's house, praised her questions about pack statutes, touched her wrist once with an absent gentleness that felt almost real. Magnus had not loved him. She had believed she could build a respectful life with him, which in Valewood counted as ambitious enough. When the officiant asked for his answer, Caius looked directly at her and smiled as if apologizing for weather. Unsuitable. The word went into the stone ring and stayed there. The officiant recorded it. Her neighbors looked away in practiced sequence, each face deciding where to put loyalty now that she had none worth defending. Caius added that her scent profile lacked stable pair resonance, that her temperament was administrative, that he released his house from further negotiations. Administrative. As if she were an inconvenient ledger column. The rite should have ended there, cruel and simple. Caius chose spectacle instead. He asked that her mark be entered publicly in the provincial register to prevent further disputes. The mark followed her home before sunset. By morning, 3 job offers had disappeared. By evening, her father stopped speaking at dinner. She learned quickly that rejection was never one moment. Rejection became a daily grammar. People paused half a second longer before answering her. Shopkeepers served others first even when she stood at the counter. Families who once asked her to read legal letters suddenly discovered they preferred privacy. Sarah, her older sister, refused to play that game. Sarah had always been practical where Magnus was principled, willing to bend procedure if procedure was trying to crush someone she loved. She ran a small apothecary and treated bruises, fevers, rut burns, and bad decisions without asking for titles. After the rite, she found Magnus in the storeroom, sitting on flour sacks, and said the one sentence no one else offered. "You are not disappearing to make them comfortable." Winter passed with no repair. Spring made it worse. Provincial rumors reached the capital, and the mark unsuitable became shorthand for every vacancy she applied to fill. Caius had moved upward fast through treaty circles, carrying his rejection of her like proof of discernment. By 2030, Sarah placed a narrow blue vial on the kitchen table and told her the risk plainly. The suppressant inside could flatten a female wolf's scent signature to near null for fixed intervals. It was legal only with registry authorization because concealment affected pairing law, succession claims, and treaty legitimacy. Using it without active permission counted as fraud. Sarah also told her what waiting honestly would mean. Caius has friends in the provincial board. He has already made one call against you. If your profile remains open here, he can bury every application until you age out of strategic pair years. Magnus knew exactly how law should work. She had copied statutes for local magistrates since she was 17. She knew exactly how law worked when powerful men wanted outcomes first and procedure second. She accepted the vial. The choice resolved one obstacle and opened another. She could leave Valewood and vanish into the capital's lower clerical lanes under sentinel status, which made employment possible. But every day she kept that disguise, she would be feeding the same system that had taught her survival required self-erasure. The capital swallowed names for a living, and Magnus entered its mouth quietly. Ironhold Palace employed hundreds of clerks to maintain grain treaties, border disputes, bloodline registries, military rosters, and scent records. Nobody admitted mattered until they mattered all at once. Under null registration, she became useful in exactly the way Caius had mocked: administrative, precise, unnoticed. She worked in archive chambers with dry air and stone walls that held old cold even in summer. Matron Iselle Dane supervised the scent registry wing, a severe woman with silver hair braided tight and fingers stained with ink. Iselle had trained Magnus years earlier at a provincial legal seminar and pretended not to recognize her on the first day. 2 hours later, when the other clerks left for broth, Isel slid a stack of correction slips across the desk and murmured without looking up. Your indexing is still superior to everyone in this wing. It was the nearest thing to welcome she received in the capital. The suppressant schedule ruled her life. Dose at dawn. Reinforce at dusk. Miss one and risk scent bleed in crowded corridors. Sarah shipped vials through coded apothecary invoices that looked like cough tincture renewals. For 12 months, Magnus lived inside that timetable, measuring safety in glass volume, counting how many work hours remained before the next dose. She told herself concealment was temporary until she secured permanent placement. Temporary became routine. Routine became identity. If anyone had asked her by mid-2031 who she was, she could have answered with job functions and shelf codes and never touched the central truth. Female wolf with no room left for honest scent. Winter Accord Week arrived in 2031 with the city locked under hard snow and political visitors filling every corridor from dawn to midnight. Winter Accord lasted 7 days and concentrated enough treaty bargaining to reshape borders. It also brought Caius Thornmere back into daily orbit of the palace. Magnus heard his voice before she saw him, smooth and measured in the upper rotunda while she carried succession ledgers to the council vault. Her body reacted faster than thought, pulse jumping, breath shortening with old humiliation. She turned into a side passage and nearly collided with one of the wolves assigned to inner security. "Records wing," he said, flat. She held up the ledger seal and kept walking. Her final legal renewal request had been denied 2 weeks earlier on technical grounds she never saw written. Sarah sent one message by courier coded as herb inventory, 3 lines only. Thornmere auditors froze my supply permits. I got you one last vial. Use only if cornered. One final vial reserve. One night at most. Magnus stared at that message until ink blurred. The next 7 days would place Caius 3 hallways away from her. One missed dose in that environment could expose everything. Fraud, forged renewals, false caste status, all of it tied to Syrah's license and Yisel's registry desk. She planned like a clerk because planning was the only control left. She skipped communal meals to avoid close quarters. She traded day shifts for night inventory in the council vault where fewer bodies meant fewer scent traces. She saved the last vial for the opening banquet, the densest night of all. The vial bought her exactly 1 night. On day 2 of Accord, her skin started to feel too tight by evening, the early warning she had dreaded for months. She checked the satchel pocket 3 times out of habit before remembering there was nothing left. She had no dose for dusk. She considered running before anyone could identify her. She reached the service stair and stopped with her hand on the rail because escape resolved only panic, not consequence. If she disappeared now, Sarah would be charged alone. Isel would be audited. Caius would still own the narrative. Unstable female clerk deceived the crown and fled. The obstacle she resolved in that stairwell was paralysis. She could not protect anyone by vanishing. She turned back to finish inventory in the council vault. The vault sat below the treaty hall, thick stone and iron doors, lined with scent-blocking cedar meant to preserve parchment from mold and tampering. Magnus carried a lantern through aisle C, cross-checking lineage codices against temporary accession lists, repeating numbers under her breath to stay steady. By the time she reached shelf 47, she knew her concealment had failed. The world smelled too sharp. Wax, cedar oil, old vellum, distant iron from guard armor above. Her own scent began to lift through the chemical haze like heat through snow. Footsteps sounded at the far door. One person, heavy and unhurried. She expected a guard. Raven Ironhold stepped into the lantern light. She had seen him only at a distance before, a black silhouette on balconies, a voice carried by stone. Up close, he seemed less theatrical and more dangerous, authority compressed into stillness, as if every movement had already been argued and approved inside him. His gaze found her once and did not leave. She felt the exact instant recognition hit him because his shoulders locked. Tiny shift. Almost nothing. And the air changed as if the room itself braced. Magnus had no script for this. King-grade alphas could track bonded signatures at close range. Everyone knew that as doctrine and gossip. Yet doctrine had never mattered to her life until his pupils narrowed and she realized he was listening to her scent the way others listened to confession. She set the ledger down carefully, hands visible. "Your Majesty, I can explain registry discrepancies." His expression did not soften. "You are Magnus Valewood." Not a question. She swallowed. Yes. Security would be here in seconds if he called. Fraud statutes were explicit. Concealment affecting succession during Treaty Week could justify immediate arrest and closed hearing. Raven took one step closer. "Who supplied your suppressants?" She heard accusation and answered with defiance, because fear always made her honest in the wrong direction. "Charge me alone." He went very still again. That same dangerous stillness. "4 wolves will take post outside your quarters tonight. You do not leave unescorted. You do not speak to Thornmere without me present." Magnus blinked, struggling to fit those words into any known legal framework. "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Then this is containment." "This is protection." She almost laughed from nerves and disbelief. "Against whom?" His jaw tightened once. "Against the man who marked you unsuitable in 2029, discovered your maternal line carried dormant regency eligibility, and has spent 2 years rewriting law so a woman like you could never stand near this throne." She misread him anyway, because her wound had taught one interpretation for powerful men, and she did not yet have a second language. She assumed he wanted evidence preserved for a cleaner prosecution, scent witness isolated, potential scandal controlled. Protection could mean the same architecture as prison if someone else held the key. The 4 wolves arrived before she reached her door. Gray cloaks, no insignia visible, disciplined enough to avoid eye contact. She learned their names over the next day because naming people made fear smaller. Torin, Ivar, Nesta, and Bryn. They rotated in pairs and followed her at a respectful distance through archive corridors, while rumors spread ahead of them like smoke. No one called her by name anymore. She became the null clerk under royal guard. By day 3, Caius requested a scent fraud hearing. The petition accused Magnus of illegal concealment, fraudulent caste registration, and potential manipulation of royal scent identification during treaty deliberations. Caius framed it as constitutional hygiene, succession protection, international stability. His language remained immaculate while its purpose stayed viciously personal. He did not need her convicted. He needed her discredited before Raven could formalize any claim, especially once her dormant regency line became visible. Magnus read the petition in Isel's office with numb hands. He knew. Isel closed the door, hands trembling for the first time Magnus had ever seen. "He suspected your profile mattered. He traced your mother's line to regency eligibility months ago, and from that day he needed you buried under null records before the king could ever scent you." "Why did you approve my registry file?" Isel sat slowly. "Because you came to me after 2029 with no legal shelter left. Because I told myself temporary deception was mercy. Because Thornmere found the discrepancy 6 months later and showed me my son's debt notices. He said if I corrected your file, he would call the debt due in full. I kept altering caste logs to keep you hidden and keep my son solvent for 1 more month, then 1 more. New information hit like cold water. Isel had not simply helped out of kindness. She had been coerced, trapped between her son's financial ruin and Magnus's survival, and Caius had engineered both outcomes with administrative precision. The obstacle now was larger than her own fear. Every silence she kept protected the architecture Caius built. Hearing day was set for day 5 of Accord, giving him exactly enough time to circulate narratives and pressure council members before formal testimony. Raven's legal office sent no personal message. Guards remained. Silence thickened. Magnus interpreted that silence as strategic distance. If he had identified a mate signature in the vault, he was now containing the problem until treaty math decided whether she was worth political cost. Her old lesson held, never mistake attention for loyalty. Day 4 brought the first crack she could not fully explain away. She was sorting military stipend records in the lower archive when raised voices echoed from the adjacent chamber. Caius and Raven, no witnesses she could see. Magnus froze beside the shelf, heart pounding, unwilling to eavesdrop and unable to move. Caius spoke first, controlled anger under polished diction. Northgate signatures are ready. You lose this treaty if you indulge instinct over governance. Raven answered in his usual clipped cadence. Withdraw your hearing petition. You would jeopardize winter grain roots for a fraudulent null female. She is not fraudulent. She carries dormant Regency blood. Claim her and Thornmere loses succession leverage. She survived yours? A chair scraped. Footsteps approached. Magnus grabbed the nearest ledger and pretended to read while the door opened. Caius exited without acknowledging her, eyes hard enough to cut. Raven followed, stopped when he saw her, and for one suspended second she watched something unguarded move through his face. Concern, anger, something that looked too personal to be political. He masked it instantly. Return to your quarters before dusk. She nodded because speaking felt unsafe. That night she lay awake while Torin and Nesta traded watches outside, replaying Raven's words until meaning frayed. She survived yours. The phrase made no sense if he saw her as a legal inconvenience. It made too much sense if he had already chosen a side and could not say it yet. Day 5 arrived with storm clouds and council benches full by dawn. The fraud hearing took place in the smaller justice chamber, still large enough to intimidate, carved oak, high skylight, 13 council seats on a raised arc. Raven attended as sovereign observer and said nothing while legal officers read charges. Caius prosecuted personally, which was unusual and telling. He wanted her broken by his own hands where everyone could watch. He opened with statutes. Concealment invalidates scent-based succession claims. Forged renewals constitute criminal fraud. False cast logs undermine treaty legitimacy. Every sentence landed cleanly and made his argument look objective. He saved the personal blade for cross-examination. State your name for record. Magnus Valewood. Were you marked unsuitable at the 2029 provincial pairing right? Yes. Did that rejection damage your standing? Yes. Did you choose deception instead of legal appeal? Magnus felt the chamber leaning toward the answer it wanted. Shame as self-indictment. She looked once at Raven and found his gaze on her. Steady. Unreadable. Not rescue. Not command. Only attention that felt like being held upright. I chose survival, she said. Caius smiled thinly. You forged identity records. I submitted paperwork through Matron Ysel with temporary protections. Temporary for 12 months? Yes. Because your sister supplied illegal suppressants. The question put Sarah on the execution block. Magnus had anticipated this moment all night, balancing outcomes, deciding what she could carry and what she could refuse. She could keep lying and maybe shield Sarah short-term, leaving Caius's coercion intact for the next woman he targeted. She could tell truth and burn the last wall around herself. The obstacle resolved in that breath was self-erasure. She stopped performing the null version of herself and chose visibility with consequence. Sarah Valewood supplied suppressants after your auditors blocked her permits, Magnus said, voice clear enough to echo. She forged renewal signatures because legal channels were closed under your influence. Matron Ysel altered cast logs because you blackmailed her with her son's debt, and ordered those falsifications to keep my Regency-eligible line out of review. Noise exploded across the chamber, counselors shouting, clerks scrambling, guards shifting into formation. Caius stepped back, as if she had struck him. Baseless slander! Iselle stood from the rear bench before anyone called her. Not slander. She walked to the witness rail and placed a packet of copied debt notices on the clerk's table with hands that shook and did not stop. She testified that Caius's office sent debt accelerations through private intermediaries. She testified she altered entries under coercion to keep Magnus filed beneath caste scrutiny and keep her son from collectors. She testified she had intended to correct the files after accord and had run out of courage. The hearing recessed into controlled chaos. Council legal officers moved to verify documents. Caius demanded immediate dismissal of tainted testimony. Raven finally stood, and the room quieted from reflex. Proceed to verification, he said. No summary judgment today. Magnus expected relief and felt only vertigo. Truth had been spoken publicly. Nothing got simpler. Palace unrest spread before dusk. Thornmere allies called her a manipulator who entrapped the king through concealed scent. Lower-rank workers whispered gratitude in stairwells because someone had named how coercion actually functioned. Guards doubled on council corridors. Torrin slept in a chair outside Magnus's door and pretended he had not. Night fell hard with more snow and no answers. On day 6, Sarah arrived under escort from Valewood, summoned as material witness. Magnus met her in a private antechamber with 2 legal clerks present and hugged her before protocol could stop her. Sarah smelled of rosemary oil and rode cold. You made this louder than I planned. Magnus gave a short laugh that came out rough. You planned one final vial and silence. Sarah's face tightened. I planned time. Thornmere auditors froze my procurement ledgers in late autumn. The freeze order date left me exactly 1 final vial reserve. 1 night, maybe 2 if diluted and useless, and that timing was not an accident. I chose potency. I hoped to find another supply chain before Accord began. Why didn't you tell me he cut you off directly? Because you would have run. Sarah testified that afternoon, admitting she forged suppressant renewals to keep Magnus employed and alive. She accepted legal exposure without bargaining. Her practicality had always looked hard from outside. Magnus saw the love inside it with painful clarity. Late that evening, Raven requested private audience. Magnus almost refused. 5 days under guard and silence had trained her to expect terms, not honesty. But curiosity won by 1 tired inch. She followed Ivar through a side corridor to the old observatory chamber above the north wall, where treaty maps once hung and now only winter stars looked in through cracked glass. Raven waited alone. He did not ask her to sit. He remained by the window, shoulders rigid, as if physical stillness was the only way he knew to keep control over what had to be said. You think I kept you under guard as leverage, he said. Yes. You think I delayed because I weighed treaty value against you? Yes. He nodded once, accepting the accusation as earned. In 2026, I recognized a mate signature at court. The room seemed to narrow. This was the first time he had opened any personal door. Magnus stayed silent. She declared bond in private and denied it in public within the same week. Her house had arranged the deception to extract border concessions from my predecessor. They used the law's urgency around scent recognition, forced emergency terms, then voided the claim and called it misunderstanding. The concessions remained. 32 soldiers died holding a line that should never have moved. He looked at her then, and she saw the wound under the armor with shocking precision. Coldness as discipline, distance as survival, attachment as exploitable weakness with graves attached. After that, he said, I swore no private recognition would govern public law again. The night in the vault, When I identified you, I knew two things at once. You were mine by bond. Thornmere would move to destroy you before sunrise. Magnus felt anger and tenderness collide in the same breath. You could have told me. I could not risk your words being used before evidence locked. If you denied me under pressure, they would name it fraud. If you accepted without context, they would name coercion. He stepped closer, still careful, as if any sudden move would close her off permanently. Protection was the only action I could take immediately that kept you alive through a council challenge. She believed him. The belief did not erase the hurt of being managed in the dark, but it changed the shape of it. His silence had not been indifference. It had been fear with a crown on top. The hearing is not over, she said quietly. No. Caius will push no confidence tomorrow. Yes. She held his gaze. If you claim me publicly, you lose Northgate. I lose Thornmere's version of Northgate. That answer opened the next loop immediately. If he rejected the treaty, grain routes might destabilize before spring. Caius had built his leverage on that reality. Raven could choose her and pay economic cost measured in hungry villages. A claim that cost nothing would have been easy to trust. This one came with numbers and risk and enemies. Day 7 dawned gray and brittle. Verification reports from the hearing confirmed document coercion in Isel's case and procurement interference in Syrah's. Audit ledgers also established that Thornmere's permit freeze was timed to exhaust Sarah's stock at one final vial during accord, forcing a predictable lapse and premeditated exposure. Caius still held enough council influence to argue that regardless of his methods, Magnus's concealment disqualified any royal claim during accord. He filed emergency no confidence before noon. By late afternoon, the hall filled for final treaty session and confidence vote. 600 witnesses took their places, councilors in front tiers, provincial delegates behind, military officers lining the walls. The public claiming right platform stood covered near the dais, waiting to see if it would be used or removed. Magnus stood under guard near the west aisle and made her own decision before anyone called for it. She had spent years reacting to structures built by other people. She would not enter whatever came next as cargo. The obstacle she resolved was disposability. She would choose him actively or walk away publicly. No hidden middle. When the clerk read no confidence terms and Caius offered Raven one last path to stability, Magnus stepped forward without permission. Council ushers moved to block her. Raven raised one hand and they stopped. I request standing, she said, voice carrying farther than she expected. Not as null clerk, as Magnus Valewood. Murmurs swept the benches. Caius gave a polite smile sharpened by panic. You have spoken enough for 1 week. She met his eyes for the first time since 2029 and discovered fear had left space where humiliation used to live. In 2029, you called me unsuitable in front of my pack and used that mark to cut every legal route I had. You chose my silence as proof you were right. You do not own the next sentence. She turned to the council. I concealed scent for 12 months under suppressants supplied by my sister. I filed under null status with altered logs signed by Matron Isel under coercion. I did this because the law that should have protected me had been weaponized by a man seeking treaty control and trying to erase my regency eligibility before the throne could legally see it. You can censure me for concealment. You cannot call coercion governance. No one interrupted. She faced Raven then, heart loud enough to blur the hall edges. If you claim me tonight, understand what you claim. A woman with public fraud attached. A sister who forged documents. A mentor who falsified records to save her son. A kingdom that will test your choice by every famine and border storm it can name. Raven's voice was low and absolute. I understand. She held him there 1 second longer. I choose this with full knowledge of cost. His pupils widened, minimal tell, and she knew he had heard what mattered. She was not being selected. She was choosing. The clerk called the no confidence roll. One by one, counselors stood. Names and votes rang through the hall like hammer strikes. Thornmere Block voted yes. Border moderates hesitated. 2 abstained. Final count: 8 yes, 5 no. Short of the threshold, 9 of 13 required. The motion failed. Caius's shoulders dropped a fraction, first visible crack in his control all week. Raven did not look at him. He walked to the claiming platform, pulled the cover away, and extended his hand toward Magnus exactly as he had in the cold open, palm up, no command in it. She walked to him because choosing sometimes looked like crossing 10 feet under 600 pairs of eyes, while old shame screamed for retreat. The public claiming words were older than Ironhold, simpler than law, designed for clarity over flourish. I, Raven Ironhold, claim Magnus Valewood as mate under bond and crown. I place my authority, protection, and name with hers in witness of this hall. Magnus answered in the form reserved for reciprocal consent. I, Magnus Valewood, accept Raven Ironhold as mate and king. I place my life, counsel, and will with his in witness of this hall. Raven touched his forehead to hers, brief and deliberate. The hall inhaled as one body, then sound returned in layers. Disbelief, outrage, relief. Applause from lower benches first, restrained at the front, spreading anyway. Caius moved toward the council rail. I challenge coercion. Raven turned, still holding Magnus's hand. State evidence. Caius opened his mouth, closed it. Hearing records now documented his own coercion patterns, his targeted suppression of a Regency-eligible claimant, and the timed permit freeze that left Syrah one final vial. Any coercion claim from him sounded like self-indictment. He had no witness willing to stand after Isel and Sarah testified. Council Marshal stepped beside him with 2 guards. Under emergency authority tied to verified tampering, Caius Thornmere was stripped of rank pending criminal review and remanded in chains before midnight. He left the hall with his back straight, face bloodless, and eyes fixed somewhere beyond all of them. Immediate outcomes followed fast because power hated a vacuum. Raven's legal office suspended Thornmere treaty terms and activated contingency grain routes through Eastfall ports at higher tariff. The choice cost Treasury reserves and angered 3 allied houses by dawn. Raven signed the orders without public defense. Isel petitioned for full testimony protection and offered archival evidence against 2 more intermediaries. The council granted pardon conditioned on retirement from active registry duty. She chose monastery archives in the South Wing district, where records went to be kept safe and mostly forgotten. Before she left, she pressed Magnus's hands and said, almost smiling, "You always indexed by principle first, never by convenience." Syrah expected prison. Instead, Raven appointed her provisional royal chemist under supervised charter, arguing the court required independent alchemical oversight precisely because suppressant controls had been weaponized. Half the hall called it scandal. Magnus called it justice with practical footwear. The harder repair was private. 3 nights after the claim, Magnus met Raven in the map room where no witnesses lingered. They talked like 2 people relearning speech after years in different languages. She told him where silence had hurt, how being guarded without explanation reopened 2029 in her body, how she needed partnership rather than benevolent confinement. He listened without interruption, a discipline that looked almost painful. He told her what vigilance cost him, how every affection once felt like tactical exposure, how his first instinct remained to lock danger out physically and explain later if there was time left. He did not excuse it. He named it and asked for room to unlearn. Their bond did not erase those patterns overnight. It created a framework where both could challenge them in real time. When fear made him controlling, she said it plainly. When old shame made her expect abandonment at any disagreement, he answered with action before reassurance, showing up where he said he would, including her in decisions that carried risk. Winter ended. Legal proceedings moved slower than gossip and faster than tradition. By spring 2032, the palace drafted cent-right reform statutes under a new office Raven created for Magnus, Queen Consort Regent for caste reform, title formalized through council ratification and public right. The office held authority to audit registry processes, review pairing rejections for coercive influence, and authorize emergency suppressant access through independent channels so no single advisor could choke supply for political leverage again. The statutes passed after vicious debate. 7 councilors supported immediately, 3 negotiated amendments, 3 opposed until trade concessions softened unrelated disputes. Magnus learned governance had fewer clean victories than stories promised. She also learned that specific laws mattered more than symbolic speeches once crowds went home. The enacted reforms included 4 changes she insisted on personally. Any provincial unsuitable mark now required written evidence review by a rotating neutral panel within 30 days. Suppressant distribution moved to a dual signature system split between royal chemist and independent legal registrar. Cent null employment status could no longer be used to deny advancement without documented performance cause. Emergency coercion protections were extended to family members of witnesses, which canceled Ysel's son's debt acceleration orders and barred collectors tied to Thornmere intermediaries from reissuing them. Those clauses looked dry on parchment. In practice, they changed who got to survive first contact with power. Magnus visited Valewood once that autumn for a regional review hearing. The stone pairing ring still stood where Caius had rejected her in 2029. Weather had cracked one edge. Children played tag across its perimeter while elders pretended not to watch. She did not stage a dramatic return. She held open office in the old magistrate hall for 6 hours, heard 19 petitions, approved 3 emergency reviews, denied 2 with explanation, and assigned follow-up on the rest. One petitioner was a girl of 19 with shaking hands and an unsuitable mark issued last week. Magnus listened, asked for records, and recognized the same pattern she had lived. The work was slow, administrative, exactly what Caius had mocked. It turned out to be the lever that moved worlds. Her relationship with Raven settled into something less theatrical and more demanding than ceremony. 2 strong instincts learning to share command without reducing each other. He still spoke in short declaratives in council. He asked questions with her in private, increasingly in public when policy touched caste law. She still built arguments like bridges before crossing. She also learned to let silence stand when his silence meant thought, not withdrawal. On nights when treaty pressure tightened his shoulders to stone, she took him to the northern parapet where wind made politics feel small for 10 minutes. On nights when old abandonment bruises flared in her, usually after hostile council sessions, he sat with her in Archive Room C, where she once hid as null clerk, and read aloud from dry grain inventories until she laughed at the absurd tenderness of being soothed by barley projections. People asked, quietly and less quietly, whether love could be trusted when crowned men declared it in public halls. Magnus never answered with philosophy. She answered with receipts. He had sacrificed the Thornmere Treaty that promised immediate stability and chose a riskier route because it was cleaner and did not require her erasure. He had faced a no-confidence motion that needed 9 of 13 and stood exposed while votes were counted aloud, refusing to withdraw his claim language for safety. He had taken political loss from allied houses after claim night and held course through spring audits. He had made room for her authority, where kings usually made decorative roles. She had answered in kind. She testified against her own false identity when silence would have been easier. She chose him publicly with full knowledge of cost and refused to become a passive emblem afterward. She accepted governance with all its compromise and paperwork and patient conflict, instead of mistaking one ceremony for completion. Their fulfillment came from that sequence, choice, cost, action, repair, repeated until trust felt less like promise and more like structure. By winter 2032, exactly 1 year after claim night, Ironhold held a smaller coronation rite for the consort regency charter. Snow fell early and soft. The hall held fewer people than the treaty crisis, no 600 this time, mostly council, clerks, provincial delegates, and workers whose names never entered songs. Isel attended in monastery gray, seated near the back with archive staff, hands folded calm. Sarah stood by the chemist delegation table in formal blue, trying not to look pleased and failing in the eyes. Torin, Ivar, Nesta, and Bryn worked security perimeter by habit, still alert, still her first improbable line of defense. Raven placed the Regency seal in Magnus's palm and spoke the installation oath without grand embellishment. "Rule with me. Correct me when I drift. Stand when I cannot." She answered, "Stand with me when they call me unsuitable again in new language." A few people laughed softly, tension breaking in the safest way, and even Raven's mouth shifted at the corner, brief and real. When the rite ended, crowds drifted toward hot wine and winter bread. Magnus stayed a moment on the dais, looking out over faces that no longer looked away from her by default. Some still doubted, some always would. Doubt did not scare her now the way dismissal once had. She had been publicly rejected in 2029 and publicly claimed in 2031. The deeper change came in 2032, when she learned public recognition meant little unless followed by enforceable law and daily choices that matched it. Raven moved beside her quietly. "You are cold?" She glanced at him. "You are evaluating whether as policy risk again." "It is habit." "It is endearing when misapplied." He made that almost smile again. "You misread me less now." "I misread you better now." They walked down together into the crowd, no guards between them, though security ringed the room as always, and Magnus felt something settle where old fear used to live. Not fantasy, not invulnerability, not the promise that power would never wound again. She felt claimed and choosing at once, seen by the one man whose recognition could not be argued away, and surrounded by a structure they had paid to build together. Expensive, imperfect, real. Outside, snow kept falling over Ironhold's roofs and courtyards, covering old tracks by morning and leaving the roads clear enough for people to make new ones.